Picture a city where the market sells silk from China, ivory from Africa, and purple fabric dyed with the juice of Mediterranean mollusks. Your city is the largest in the world. Its treasury holds more gold than several hundred grown men weigh combined. Its walls are unbreakable. Its army has never lost. Its name is known across 3 continents. 100 years later, nothing is left. Except, the story does not end in rubble, because the name of that city and everything it ever invented, its laws, its images, its curses, keeps living. In the speeches of politicians, in religious texts, in the architecture of capitals built 1,000 years later, cities die, ideas don't. Why did the richest, best fortified, most powerful cities in history collapse at the very peak of their greatness? What if wealth is not a shield, but a death sentence? And the real question, if every single one of these civilizations believed it was building something permanent, what does that say about us today? Today, we look at 5 cities that stood at the top of the world. We'll see them at their moment of maximum power and understand why that very moment was the beginning of the end. And at the finish, there's a question that's not so easy to brush off. Chapter 1. Alexandria, the city that gathered the whole world in one place, around 330 to 30 BC. To understand Alexandria, you first have to understand the man who built it. Alexander the Great was 25 years old when he conquered Egypt. By that point, he had already taken Greece, Persia, and half of Asia Minor. But in Egypt, he did something no conqueror before him had done. Instead of looting the country and leaving, he stopped on the Mediterranean shore, looked at an empty strip of land between the sea and Lake Mareotis, and told his architects that a city would stand here. Not a fortress, not a trading post, a city. Alexandria was designed from scratch, on a Greek urban plan, with straight streets crossing at right angles, and a harbor built to receive hundreds of ships at once. According to legend, Alexander himself scattered grain across the ground to mark the boundaries of future neighborhoods. Birds flew down and ate it. The priests said it was a good omen. The city would feed the whole world. They were right, though Alexander never saw it. He left to conquer more and died in Babylon in 323 BC, never returning. The Ptolemies understood something nobody before them had grasped. Knowledge is power in a literal material sense. Whoever controls information controls trade, navigation, medicine, philosophy, controls everything. And they began collecting knowledge as methodically as other kings collected gold. The Library of Alexandria was not just a building with shelves. It was a state project to monopolize the intellect. According to legend, there was a standing order. Every ship entering Alexandria's harbor had to surrender any scrolls it carried for inspection. They were copied, sometimes keeping the original and returning a copy, and added to the collection. At its peak, the library held, by various estimates, between 400,000 and 700,000 scrolls. It was the entire written memory of humanity gathered in a single place. Next to the library stood the Mauseon, literally a temple of the muses, the prototype of the modern university. Scholars lived and worked there on state stipends. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the Earth to within less than 2% accuracy. In the 2nd century BC, without satellites or surveying instruments, using only 2 wells, the sun and geometry. Euclid wrote Elements there, a geometry textbook still used in the 19th century. Heron of Alexandria described dozens of mechanical devices, from automatic temple doors to a device that spun on steam power. He did not try to change the world with these inventions. He simply recorded what was possible. That in itself is the Alexandrian way of thinking. Write it down, preserve it, pass it on, and let someone later figure out what it is for. The city itself, by the 1st century BC, was the second largest in the world after Rome, around 1 million residents. Its lighthouse on the island of Pharos, roughly 400 to 450 feet tall, was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world and guided ships from a distance of up to 30 miles. Its neighborhoods were strictly divided by ethnicity: Greek, Jewish, Egyptian, later Roman. But all of them spoke one language, Greek Koine, the first truly global language of cross-cultural communication in history. It was in Alexandria that the Greek translation of the Jewish scriptures was made, the Septuagint. That translation later became foundational for early Christian theology. Alexandria was where Christian doctrine was shaped in the 1st centuries AD. The Alexandrian theological school was one of the most influential in the ancient world. Alexandria was a machine for producing ideas, and like any machine, it needed fuel. The fuel was political stability, and that was running out. The Ptolemies were degenerating, literally and politically. Cleopatra VII, the last of the dynasty, was arguably the most intelligent ruler of them all. She knew 9 languages, was the first Ptolemaic ruler to learn Egyptian, and understood that her small kingdom would survive only in alliance with one of the great powers. She bet first on Caesar, then on Antony. She lost to Octavian. In 30 BC, Egypt became a Roman province. Alexandria remained a city, wealthy, populous, cultured, but no longer a capital, no longer a center. The library faded gradually, not in one fire, as people like to believe, but through a series of political decisions, wars, and simply the absence of funding. By the 4th and 5th centuries AD, almost nothing was left. But what had been copied, transcribed, memorized, and carried away survived. Greek mathematics, medicine, philosophy, astronomy, all of it reached us through the Alexandrian tradition. Medieval Arab scholars translating Greek texts were working from copies that had spread across the world before the library disappeared. Alexandria did not preserve knowledge, it distributed it before dying. And here is what's worth noting. The next city on our list also stood on water, was also built from nothing, and was also the largest in its hemisphere. But its builders knew absolutely nothing about Alexandria. They invented everything on their own. Chapter 2. Babylon, the city that invented the idea of empire. Around 1760 to 539 BC, when Ur crumbled, its administrative legacy did not disappear. It relocated. Several centuries later, a new center rose on the same Mesopotamian plain, Babylon. The very word Babylon in Akkadian means gates of the gods, and that was not merely a pretty image. For the people of the Bronze and Iron Ages, Babylon truly was a city where worlds intersected. Its geographic position made it the trade and cultural crossroads through which routes ran from Iran to the Mediterranean and from Anatolia to southern Mesopotamia. But before talking about the city at its height, it's important to understand how it got there, because the story of its founding is as extraordinary as the city itself. The first great flourishing of Babylon is tied to a name you probably know from school: Hammurabi. Around the 1760s BC, he united most of Mesopotamia and created what historians call the Old Babylonian Kingdom. His famous law code, not the first code of laws in history, and that distinction matters, was the first so systematically organized and publicly declared that any resident could theoretically know what penalty awaited a given action. The stela of laws stood in the square. It sent a signal. Here, not arbitrary will rules, but order. Then came the Bronze Age collapse, a mysterious catastrophe of the 13th and 12th centuries BC, when entire civilizations vanished almost simultaneously. Mycenaean Greece fell, the Hittite Empire crumbled, the palace civilization in Crete ceased to exist. Babylon weakened too, but, and this is the critical point, it survived. And a few centuries later, it rose again. The new Babylon, reaching its peak under Nebuchadnezzar II in the 6th century BC, was no longer just a trading city. It was a symbol, the capital of an empire stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean coast. By some estimates, its population reached 200,000, a number European cities would not surpass for nearly another 1,000 years. The city was encircled by double walls thick enough, according to tradition, for 2 chariots to pass side by side on top. The Ishtar Gate, faced with vivid blue glazed brick and decorated with images of bulls and dragons, was one of the most recognizable architectural landmarks of the ancient world. The main ziggurat, Etemenanke, the house that is the foundation of heaven and earth, rose, by various estimates, to a height of between 300 and 330 feet. Many historians consider it the model for the biblical Tower of Babel. In Babylon lived deported peoples from across the empire. Jews, taken there after the destruction of Jerusalem in 587 BC. Phoenicians, Arameans, peoples from Syria, Arabia, Elam. Nebuchadnezzar continued a policy invented by Assyria before him. Mass relocations of conquered peoples. The administrative logic was to mix everyone together until local identities dissolved, and the imperial one became the only one that remained. But it played out differently. It was in the Babylonian exile that the Jews reimagined their religion. It was here, watching the construction of a massive ziggurat on which hundreds of thousands of workers labored, speaking dozens of languages, that they wrote the story of a tower whose construction God destroyed by confusing the builders' tongues. It was here that Judaism was born in the form we know. And from Judaism, a few centuries later, came Christianity. And from Christianity, Islam. 3 world religions, followed today by more than half of all humanity, carry the imprint of this city. But in 539 BC, Babylon fell. The Persian king Cyrus the Great entered it, and apparently without much of a fight. The gates were opened. The last Babylonian king, Belshazzar, according to biblical tradition, was feasting that evening while on the wall appeared fire-written words, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Uparsin. Numbered, weighed, divided. A verdict. Physically, the city survived for several more centuries, but as an independent force, it ended that same night. Its images, however, never ended. The Whore of Babylon, from the Book of Revelation. The Tower of Babel as a metaphor for chaos. Saddam Hussein rebuilding the ruins of Babylon in the 1980s and stamping his own name on each brick beside Nebuchadnezzar's. Literally, this is documented. Osama bin Laden, calling the United States the New Babylon in his declarations of 1998. Cities die, their images don't. But Babylon was only an intermediate link in a long chain, because before it collapsed, there existed yet another empire, brutal, intelligent, and still underestimated, one that invented nearly everything we credit to Rome. Chapter 3. Tenochtitlan, the city built in the middle of a lake. Around 1325 to 1521 AD. When Spanish conquistadors under Hernán Cortés first saw Tenochtitlan in November of 1519, they went silent. Bernal Díaz del Castillo, one of the expedition's participants, wrote about that moment in his memoirs, a text that has survived to this day. The soldiers stood on the causeway leading into the city, looking at towers and pyramids rising from the water, and could find no words. Some asked aloud, "Was this a dream?" Diaz wrote that everything they saw seemed like things from books about knightly adventures, the kind that describe enchanted castles rising from lakes. It was not a dream, and not a castle. It was a city with a population of roughly 200 to 250,000 people, by some estimates, one of the 5 largest cities in the world at the time, comparable to Paris or Constantinople of that era. Built on an island in the middle of Lake Texcoco, in the Valley of Mexico, it was connected to the shore by 3 paved causeways wide enough for 8 horsemen to ride abreast. Fresh water was delivered by an aqueduct. Canals cut through the neighborhoods like streets. Flat-bottomed boats were the main mode of transport. But before talking about the city at its height, it's worth saying where it came from, because the story of its founding is as unlikely as the city itself. The Aztecs, or more precisely, the Mexica as they called themselves, arrived in the Valley of Mexico as unwanted outsiders. According to their own chronicles, they had wandered south for centuries from the north, hired themselves out as mercenaries to stronger neighbors, and occupied the worst land that anyone left them. Their neighbors looked down on them. When the Mexica once sacrificed the daughter of a neighboring ruler, those neighbors simply expelled them to the swampy islands in the middle of the lake, where survival seemed impossible. The Mexica survived, and not just survived, they turned their exile into an advantage. On the shallow marshland, they developed a system of floating gardens, chinampas. These were rectangular plots literally built on water. Layers of algae, silt, and soil piled onto a wooden frame, with plant roots gradually reaching the bottom and anchoring the structure. Crops on chinampas could be harvested several times a year, exceptionally fertile soil, constant access to water. The famine that periodically devastated other valley cities was almost unknown in Tenochtitlan. From mercenary fighters, the Mexica became a military empire in the span of 100 years. By the time the Spanish arrived, the Triple Alliance they led controlled most of present-day Mexico, from the Pacific coast to the Gulf of Mexico. The annual tribute flowing into Tenochtitlan from across that territory was staggering. Tens of thousands of tons of food, cotton, cacao, feathers, gold, obsidian, and captives. The market at Tlatelolco, the trading district immediately adjacent to Tenochtitlan, astonished the Spanish more than the pyramids themselves. Cortés wrote to Charles V that he had seen nothing like it in Spain or anywhere in Europe. Thousands of traders, strict order, supervisory judges, standardized prices, specialized sections, slaves, birds, spices, jewelry, ceramics, building materials. At the center of the city rose the Templo Mayor, a double pyramid dedicated to the gods of war and rain. It was not simply a religious structure. It was a political act repeated with every generation. Each new ruler built a new layer on top of the previous one, literally embedding himself into the body of the city. Archaeologists excavating the Templo Mayor in the 20th century, in the very center of Mexico City, found 7 successive layers of construction. Tenochtitlan was a city that grew like a living thing. But inside it was a systemic contradiction. And that contradiction is what destroyed it. Aztec military expansion was, to a significant degree, ritual in nature. They needed not just victories, they needed captives for sacrifice. There was even a form called flower wars, arranged battles with neighboring peoples, the purpose of which was not conquest, but the capture of living prisoners. This meant that many defeated peoples were not destroyed or assimilated. They remained in a state of permanent humiliation, suppliers of victims and resources. When Cortés arrived with a handful of soldiers, roughly 500 men against an empire with hundreds of thousands of warriors, he grasped this contradiction immediately and began using it methodically. The Tlaxcalans, the Totonacs, and other peoples groaning under Aztec dominance came to the Spanish on their own. By the time of the final assault on Tenochtitlan in 1521, Cortés had around 900 Spaniards and, by some estimates, between 80 and 100,000 indigenous allies from peoples previously subjugated by the Aztecs. But before the final assault began, the city was already dying from within, and not from Spanish swords. In 1520, smallpox broke out in Tenochtitlan, a European disease against which the people of the New World had no immunity whatsoever, biological or even conceptual, because they had never encountered a contagion like this before. It spread faster than any army. By some estimates, between a third and half of the city's population died within a few months. The supreme ruler Cuitlahuac, who had replaced Montezuma, died. Thousands of warriors, priests, and administrators perished, the entire living machinery of the city's governance. When Cortés returned to the walls of Tenochtitlan, he found that the hardest part of the work had already been done by an invisible force that no one had summoned or planned for. This was not a military defeat, it was a biological catastrophe layered on top of political isolation. 3 months of siege finished what remained of the city. In August of 1521, the last ruler, Cuauhtémoc, was captured in a canoe trying to break through the blockade. But the story of Tenochtitlan did not end the moment the trap snapped shut on the lake. It ended 4 years later, in a jungle, with a rope, and the last words of a man who had seen everything coming. After the fall, Cortés kept Cuauhtémoc alive and at his side, a living symbol of the conquered empire. But when gold was needed, the prisoner became a tool. Cuauhtémoc's feet were covered in oil and held over open flames. The purpose was simple: tell us where the treasure is hidden. Next to him, his companion screamed and begged for mercy. Cuauhtémoc turned to him and said, "And do you think I am on a bed of roses?" Then he fell silent. He said nothing more. The gold was never found. Not then, not now. In 1525, Cortés had him hanged on a fabricated charge of conspiracy. Before the execution, Cuauhtémoc spoke his last words directly to his captor. "I knew what your promises were worth, and I knew it would end this way." The winners built a city on his ruins. The losers built a nation around his name. The Spanish razed Tenochtitlan to the ground and built Mexico City on its ruins, the new capital of New Spain. The stones of the Templo Mayor went into the construction of a Spanish cathedral, which stands on the same plaza to this day. Parts of the lake were drained. The canals were filled in. But what was not filled in endures. The very idea of a city built in water, a city you can build where no one expects it, survived. The Chinampas still exist in the outskirts of modern Mexico City as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs, gave hundreds of words to Spanish and through it to other languages: chocolate, avocado, tomato, cacao, chili. Every time you eat guacamole or drink hot chocolate, you are using the legacy of an empire destroyed 500 years ago. And every year on Mexico's Independence Day, the president steps onto the same balcony overlooking the Templo Mayor, excavated right in the center of the city in the 1970s, and reads aloud the names of the heroes of the struggle against Spanish colonialism. The first name on that list is Cuauhtémoc, the man who said nothing under torture, the man whose last words were a verdict on his conqueror. The city is dead. Its last ruler is the national hero of the country that grew up on its ruins. Cities die. Their ideas don't. But if you think this is only about the distant past, the next chapter is about a city that left behind not just ideas. It left behind the system itself, the one whose rules we still live by. Chapter 4. Rome, the city that died for 1,000 years. Around the 1st through 5th centuries AD Rome is the most complicated case on our list, because when people talk about its fall, they usually cite 476 AD, the year when the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by the Germanic commander Odoacer. But that date is administrative, not real. Rome did not collapse in 476. It was dying for centuries, and dying differently in its different parts. Start with the peak. Around the turn of the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, during the reigns of Trajan and Hadrian, the Roman Empire controlled territory from Scotland to Mesopotamia, from the Sahara to the Rhine. Its population was around 70 million people. Rome, as a city alone, held by various estimates between 800,000 and 1 million residents. That made it the largest urban agglomeration in the Western world, a distinction it held for the next 1,500 years. London would not reach 1 million residents until the 19th century. What made Rome Rome was not its walls or its legions. Its real invention was a way of thinking about the state as a legal, not a personal construction. Roman law, a system in which a citizen holds rights regardless of who happens to be in power today, was a revolution in the history of human organization. It is that same system that later forms the foundation of all European legal codes. It is the same system that Justinian codifies in the 6th century in Constantinople. And in that form, it reaches us today. Rome also invented infrastructure as state policy. Roads, aqueducts, sewers, public baths. These were not luxuries, but part of what made a person Roman. Any resident of London or Cologne in the Roman era lived by the same standards of city life as a resident of Rome itself. But this very complexity became the source of vulnerability. The larger the empire grew, the harder it became to sustain. Military costs rose. The tax base could not keep pace. Rome increasingly relied on Germanic federates, hired soldiers who served for pay and land without being Roman by origin. These federates lived in the empire and fought for it, but did not feel toward it the loyalty that a citizen feels. When payments were delayed, they switched sides. Or they did not switch. They simply decided one day that they were on their own. The critical moment of disintegration was not the barbarian invasions. Those are the effect. The cause was the slow demagnetization of the very idea of being Roman. 476 is not the date of a catastrophe. It is the date of a final bureaucratic formality. Odoacer, deposing Romulus Augustulus, did not destroy Rome. He sent the imperial insignia to Constantinople with a note. The West no longer exists, but you remain our emperor. Meaning, even the man who formally ended the Western Roman Empire called himself its loyal servant. That is what the real force of an idea looks like, when even your enemies keep speaking in your name. Afterward, Charlemagne is crowned in Rome in 800 AD as Emperor of the Romans. Hitler calls his country the Third Reich, the Third Roman Empire, in direct line of succession from the Holy Roman Empire and from Rome itself. Mussolini builds a new Roman Empire with eagles and fasces. The American founding fathers design a Senate, a Capitol, and a consular system in literal correspondence with Roman models. Rome did not merely leave images behind. It programmed the way Western civilization thinks about power, law, and the state. But there was one more city, one that considered itself the real Rome after the western part fell, and that lasted another 1,000 years. Around 330 to 1453 AD. In 330 AD, Emperor Constantine moved the capital of the Roman Empire to the shore of the Bosphorus and called the new city New Rome. Later the name became Constantinople, but the city's residents, throughout its entire 1,000-year history, called themselves Romaioi, Romans. This was not rhetoric, it was identity. Constantinople stood at a point that made it nearly impregnable, a narrow strait between Europe and Asia, 3 sides surrounded by water, and on the landward side, the double Theodosian walls running nearly 3 miles. Those walls were never taken by force for 1,000 years, not until 1453. For all that time, every conqueror who reached Constantinople found a stone dead end before him and turned back. But the city's true defense was not this. It was wealth. When Emperor Anastasius died in the early 6th century, the treasury held 1,100 tons of gold. To put that in perspective, the entire annual military budget with which Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire was, by historians' estimates, a few dozen tons. Constantinople paid steppe warlords to leave it alone, and that was cheaper than fighting. Attila received 6.5 tons of gold and left for the west. The Avars received subsidies and directed their raids elsewhere. Money was geopolitics. Wealth was strategy. Where did it come from? Trade. Silk, which Constantinople monopolized by secretly smuggling silkworms out of China in the 6th century. Purple fabric, dye extracted from Mediterranean mollusks, worth literally its weight in gold. Everything that flowed from Asia to Europe and back crossed through the Bosphorus. Constantinople was the customs house on the world's main trade route, and in this city survived what was already disappearing in the West: ancient civilization itself. Writing, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, archives. While in Western Europe, feudal warriors could not read and considered this perfectly normal, in Constantinople, schools operated, treatises were written, and debates raged about the nature of the Trinity with such intensity that one contemporary complained he could not buy bread without the baker explaining his position on the divine nature of Christ. But here begins a tragedy that is hard to convey briefly. In 542, plague arrived in Constantinople, the one today called the Plague of Justinian, which epidemiologists identify as the first known pandemic of bubonic plague in history. Over 20 years, it killed roughly 1/3 of the entire Eastern Roman Empire's population. In Constantinople itself, approximately half the residents died. From a city of nearly 1 million, fewer than 500,000 remained. This was an invisible war that no walls and no gold could stop. After the plague came endless simultaneous wars on multiple fronts, against Persia to the east, against the Avars and Slavs from the north, who in 620 surrounded Constantinople from 2 sides at once, against the Arabs, who from the 630s rapidly absorbed Syria, Egypt, and North Africa. Everything Constantinople still held. The treasury emptied. Churches were stripped to bare wood and stone. Their gold and silver melted down to pay for mercenary armies. Latin, as the official language, gave way to Greek, simply because almost no Latin speakers were left. By the 7th and 8th centuries, This was already a different country, not the Rome that built triumphal arches and staged victory parades. A country that prayed and fought and prayed, again and again, century after century. And yet, Constantinople held until 1453, 1,000 years after the official fall of Rome. From there, Orthodox Christianity came to Russia. From there, Ivan III took the double-headed eagle as the emblem of the Russian state, having married the niece of the last Byzantine emperor. From there was born the concept of Moscow, the third Rome, and the fourth shall not be. Constantinople did not merely leave ideas behind. It was the living thread connecting antiquity to the modern world. And when it finally broke, scholars and manuscripts fled west and helped ignite the Italian Renaissance. Let's return to the question we started with. 5 cities: Alexandria, Babylon, Tenochtitlan, Rome, Constantinople. Each at the top of its world, each destroyed. But look at what remained. Alexandria distributed the entire written memory of humanity before it died. And that knowledge, copied and carried across the world, powered every intellectual tradition that came after. Babylon gave birth to 3 world religions through its captives and handed the world the image of the great city that every era since has kept recreating. Tenochtitlan transformed the dietary vocabulary of the planet and left its last ruler as the national hero of the country built on its ruins. Rome programmed the way we think about law, citizenship, and the state. Constantinople kept ancient knowledge alive for 1,000 years after Rome fell. And when it finally ended, its scholars carried that knowledge west and lit the fire of the Renaissance. Not one of these cities truly died. They died as physical places, as administrative centers, as living organisms with populations, markets, and walls. But the ideas they generated, the ways of organizing power, the images of wealth and collapse, the notions of what a great city means, proved more durable than any stone. Saddam Hussein stamped his name next to Nebuchadnezzar's on bricks in a rebuilt Babylon. This is not a metaphor. It is a documented historical fact. Bin Laden called America the New Babylon in 1998, a city that must fall, as that one did. Every European parliament with a senate, every courthouse with columns and Latin mottos, every constitution that opens with words about the rights of citizens. All of it is the direct inheritance of Rome, which fell 1,500 years ago. And now, the question this whole thing was building toward: we live in cities that are larger, wealthier, and more powerful than anything humanity has ever built before. We create institutions, technologies, cultural images that we believe will change the world permanently. Every single city on this list believed the same thing. The question is not whether our cities will fall. They will, as everything before them has. The question is, what among the things we are making today will be alive enough to outlast us by 1,000 years? What from our world will future civilizations use without even knowing where it came from? That is what real legacy looks like. Not gold, not walls, not armies. An idea that cannot be destroyed.